Hello and welcome everyone. I'm James Quintero and this is Sunshine Week 2021, Regaining Trust in Texas Government, brought to you by the Texas Public Policy Foundation. As you may have guessed from the title of today's live stream, we are talking about Sunshine Week. And for anyone not in the know, Sunshine Week is that big, great week that we celebrate government transparency and the public's access to information. Both of those are very important concepts because, as the great James Madison said, knowledge will forever govern ignorance. And a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power knowledge gives. Now, ordinarily, Sunshine Week is a celebration of certain ideals, but it actually takes on a certain importance, a special importance this year because of a lot of the things that we've seen over the last year. And so, you know, as everyone in Texas is well familiar with, the last 12 months have really been challenging from an open government perspective. Texas have actually witnessed a certain shredding of old notions of open government and the transformation of some of our most cherished institutions into less responsive, less accessible versions of their former selves. And so now in some ways we've seen a return to normal, but there are still plenty of instances of closed door decision-making and unresponsiveness. And what's especially tragic about some of these things is that the Texas legislature in 2019 made such great strides to open government and make government more transparent. And of course, I'm referring to the efforts to restore the Public Information Act and restore the Texas Open Meetings Act. A lot of that got shelved over the past 12 months. And so with that said, let me introduce a terrific panel of experts who are going to help me make sense of what happened over the last 12 months and perhaps what's ahead over the next several months. So first we have Representative Gio Capriglione, who of course has been a longtime friend of the foundation and was instrumental last session in really advancing some key legislation that helped Texas become more transparent and more responsive. Representative, thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And then next up, we have Kelley Shannon, who is the Executive Director of the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas. She's easily the most passionate open government advocate that I know. She's been a longtime friend of mine as well. Kelley, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, sure. Glad to be here.
And then last but certainly not least, we have Donnis Baggett, who is the Executive Vice President of the Texas Press Association. I've had the honor of working alongside Donnis for a few years now with our open government advocacy. And I finally was able to arm twist him into joining me on camera to share his wealth of knowledge. So Donnis, thank you, sir. Really a pleasure.
Thank you, James. It's great to be with you. And we appreciate the PPF's firm support of transparency in government.
Well, much appreciated. Representative, I want to go to you first because, like I said, you were instrumental in passing some very substantial legislation in 2019. And I want to give the audience kind of some background information on what exactly happened in 19 and perhaps how some of that was set aside in 2020. And so can you help me and the audience understand what happened at the end of the last legislative session and how you felt coming into the interim?
Yeah. Well, first, again, thanks for having me. And James, I like how you said that this is Sunshine Week and it's a time to celebrate government transparency. But I hope that when this week is over, we switch to demand government transparency, right? Because this is something that we all have a right to. We should all continuously ask where and how our government is serving us, right? And what happened in 2019, and we're working on it, is we have seen, just like we've seen in the past, that given opportunities, sometimes it's easier for the government or people that work for the government to choose to not disclose things versus disclose them, right? Life is a lot easier when it's a lot easier for some government officials when no one knows what they're doing. and no one has any way of finding out what to do it, right? And so what we've done over the past few sessions, but over the last session specifically, is we noticed very specific things about trying to not disclose records related to contracts through the Texas Public Information Act. And there were so many people trying to find all these different excuses in terms of why they shouldn't have to release, quite frankly, the public's information about public money. But I was really excited when we left last session because we had worked really hard, all of us on this call, and thankful to TPPF and the press and the Freedom of Information Foundation and just a huge coalition of people who worked together to come to the conclusion that this is the people's information. We fought a lot of battles, we fought 100 plus stakeholders, and we were able to get it done.
Yeah, no, it was absolutely impressive what you and Senator Kirk Watson were able to do. I mean, kudos to y'all. Can you tell me a little bit about how the pandemic and specifically the government's response to the pandemic perhaps eroded the intent of that legislation?
Yeah, I mean, here, I'll just tell you, I mean, once people had the chance, I mean, listen, the reality is we hit a tough time. It was a dangerous time. We're still in the middle of a pandemic. People are still getting hurt. People were sent home. Okay, people were sent home. And so in other words, they weren't at the offices anymore. I understand why and how that happened. But what some people did, okay, and some groups did, and some organizations did, and some entities did, is they then used that as the excuse not to give that information out. And they would say, well, I'm not at the office. And the reality is I have emails on my phone from when I was a kid, right? I can get access to so much stuff. I have a Dropbox, I have virtual servers, and I am not a government entity. And so I guess my disappointment is how the pandemic became a way for this information not to be released. And that's been disappointing. And I hope we can fix a lot of that this session.
Yeah, I concur. And Kelley, you, of course, you and your team were at the forefront of a lot of the battles over 2020 to get information from government. Can you tell us a little bit about what you saw last year and some of the challenges that just ordinary Texans faced in terms of getting access to information?
Sure. We at the Freedom of Information Foundation received dozens and dozens of calls and emails over the past year where folks were trying to get information but just couldn't. And as was mentioned, at the start of the pandemic, it's understandable, offices close. We've all got to figure out a way to regroup. And, a lot of governments did file what was known as a catastrophe notice, part of a new law passed last session by Senator Huffman that gives you a 7-day reprieve. And then if you needed another 7-day extension when you have some kind of natural disaster or catastrophe. So many governments did that right off the bat. And that's kind of understandable. They're trying to figure out what we're dealing with. They're closed down. One thing that happened is those catastrophe notices started getting abused. Governments, even though they were finding ways to work remotely and still doing their business, they kept filing back to back catastrophe notices. And there's legislation this time by Senator Huffman to tweak that and make it very clear how that is supposed to be used. But in the weeks after that, what happened is governments just started relying on old Attorney General advice about when your office is closed or when you're on a skeleton crew, that you do not have to be counting those as business days to respond to the Public Information Act. So what we essentially had is many governments just saying, because our offices are physically closed, even though we're doing all this work over here remotely and on our phones and on our laptops at home, even though it's physically closed, we are not responding to any Public Information Act requests, even though the records might be available electronically. Or they said, we are working remotely, which we are calling a skeleton crew. And really a skeleton crew is designed for, like, say, a semi-holiday or such. But governments just started kind of coming up with their own definitions and saying, nah, we're on skeleton crew. So it's made a mockery of the Public Information Act with many governments, not all governments, but many governments. So all kinds of Texans, regular citizens just trying to keep a watch on their government, see how money is spent, journalists who are trying to ask questions, researchers who are trying to get information from universities, research universities, all kinds of folks were just shut down and not allowed to get the information that belongs to them, the public.
And so it sounds like maybe it was the Attorney General's guidance that was perhaps out of date. And of course, nobody foresaw, a pandemic being unleashed in 2020. But is it your contention that maybe that guidance needs to be updated?
Yeah, it absolutely needs to be updated. And we've been talking with the Attorney General's office about this. We have to always think of our open government laws as evolving and keeping up with modern times. And we've done this several times throughout the years. As records started to move from paper to electronic, things were changed in the law to make sure that that was addressed. Well, we are now in a time where everyone has discovered that the workplace is just not even looking like it looked a year ago. I mean, we already had remote working going on before this, but now we've entered a whole new era. And, this guidance does need to be keeping up with the times, but really the law needs to keep up with the times. And that's where I think Representative Capriglione is going to come into play with some legislation he's filed.
And Donnis, did the Texas Press Association see any challenges out there? Was this issue on your radar at all?
Absolutely. I mean, our people in the field all across Texas, we've got over 400 newspaper members of the Texas Press Association, and there were just countless reports of situations where governments found a little wiggle room and therefore were not responsive to the Public Information Act or even the Open Meetings Act. Mm-hmm. And it was really disappointing on a lot of levels. But at the time that Texans needed their government to be responsive the most, some governments let them down severely by hiding, by going behind closed doors, or refusing to make their records available, by refusing to engage with the very people who put them in office. And that's just not acceptable. I want to read you something. It's the prelude to Title V in the Texas Government Code. And Title V, the name of it is Open Government. And the prelude sets the stage for what the philosophy of the state of Texas is. And I'm going to read you an excerpt from that. It is the policy of this state that each person is entitled to complete information about the affairs of government and the official acts of public officials and employees. The people, in delegating authority, do not give their public servants the right to decide what is good for the people to know and what is not good for them to know. It's right there in the law before all of the particulars about open meetings and open records, and it couldn't be stated more clearly than that. And I wish that that could be tattooed on the inside of the eyelids of everybody who's elected to public office, because too many of them forget it once they get to the courthouse or the city hall or the state capitol in some cases. So yes, we saw numerous cases where the public's good was not taken into account. And as a result, they were in the dark about what government was doing or what was even going on in their communities regarding the spread of COVID and so forth.
Well said, Donnis. And I don't generally like reading state law, but I agree with you that opening preamble, it is really a treat to read, because I think it does set the tone for the spirit of open government laws in Texas. And we don't always hold true to that spirit, but it certainly provides kind of a guiding light. And I want to go back to something you said, because you brought up the Open Meetings Act. Can you just bring folks up to speed in terms of the challenges that you saw on the Open Meetings Act front?
Yes, there were instances all over the state where governments, either unintentionally or intentionally, it really doesn't matter because it had the same effect, they did not prepare adequately for the public's involvement in these virtual meetings that they were empowered to have. There was legislation passed last session to allow the governmental bodies to meet remotely when the situation dictated it. And the governor expanded on that in his disaster declaration and made it, gave them a little more latitude than they would have had otherwise, which is perfectly fine. But we saw cases where that was abused. And some of the particulars are the fact that in some cases, the only way to access that governmental meeting was to be on broadband so that you could do like we're doing today. And that's watch a Zoom call of what's going on. The problem with that is that there are 9 million Texans, about 30% of us, that don't have broadband. And it's not just in the country, it's in parts of cities as well. And people who did not have broadband, if there was not a telephone only call-in line for them to listen in to their city council meeting or their county commissioners court meeting or the local health department meeting, they didn't have any way to keep up with it. They were in the dark. At a time when they needed to know how fast this disease was being transmitted throughout their community, they were shut out of that discussion. And that's unacceptable. There's legislation this time by Representative Canales and Senator Zaffarini to fix that. We're calling it virtual meetings access. And it's HB 2683 by Representative Canales and SB 924 by Senator Zaffarini. And it would require that the governments who do have remote meetings would provide a telephone only connection in case someone doesn't have broadband. B, that they would allow the public to testify or to comment just as they would at a county commissioners court meeting during a hear visitors session. And C, that the instructions be very clear and well distributed before the meeting occurred, that there be plenty of notice and plenty of detailed notice so that folks would know how to access these meetings. So we think that these bills will go a long way. And there are other bills in play also that address these same issues. In fact, there are 19 others that I counted yesterday that address the problems that have come up in open meetings, or what were supposed to be open meetings since the COVID outbreak. So I think the legislature is certainly in tune with the fact that reform is needed. And I think we have a very good chance of getting that fixed this time through bills like HB 2683 and Senate Bill 924.
And since we're on the topic of legislation, why don't we bring in our resident lawmaker here? Because I think you have a few bills filed, sir, dealing with government transparency. And one of those that I'd like you to touch on, if you could, is HB 1416, which better defines the business day definition. And it just kind of, if you would, just walk the audience kind of through your rationale for the bill and what you hope to achieve with it.
Yeah, and so from a higher level, I'll give a story that I will not specifically mention the school district, but there's a school district, okay? And there was a constituent who was trying to get information from early on in the pandemic, from March, who was asking for an open records request for information. Now, it started in March, and we understand why maybe March wasn't good. Try to get in April, in May, June, July, August. And so it sent me, and so I get to see a response from this governmental entity about that they were not going to be able to do it because they were technically closed. They're still part of the skeleton crew. The school was open. All right. Students were coming in and out of the school district, but apparently they had this weird definition of what a business day was, what was considered a day on or day off, because they weren't there. Everyone else was, but because they were there, they did not have to respond to that request. And so what we're trying to do is to make it clear what is and isn't a business day, right? When we say 10 days, we mean 10 days, right? So obviously there are times, whether it's a holiday or whatever. So we go through the definitions of how to do that. So people cannot find a loophole and a different definition of a day. I mean, it's kind of crazy. It feels like another country sometimes, right? Where they're like, we're not going to define it. Or, and not to ding my Senate colleagues too much, but they change the day all the time too, right? But we shouldn't be able to go and let our governmental entities not be as responsive as quick as possible when the people need it most. What everyone else has said, right? I mean, for the most part, we don't all pay attention to what the government is doing all the time. But the time when we do and we need to is an emergency, a winter storm, a pandemic, a hurricane. These are the times that we are all at home trying to get every bit of news that we can, every bit of information that we can, especially that affects our families and our well-being and our tax dollars, because there's a lot of money that's spent during those times. And so we want to make sure that people can get through that legislation, get the information in a timely manner.
Yeah, no, I agree, sir. And just a quick aside, our general counsel here submitted a Public Information Act request real early on in the pandemic. And I think, at the beginning, there's every reason to give the benefit of the doubt to the city government in question. But as time progressed and kind of the question was out there lingering, you start wondering after, 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, are these guys ever going to respond? And it goes back to Kelley's point about some of the guidance coming from the Attorney General's office and perhaps how it was misapplied in these times. And I think what HB 1416 gets at is very much needed to prevent instances like that from occurring in the future. Now, Representative, you also have another bill that gets at a problem that I've long struggled with, and it's not isolated to the pandemic. It's actually been a frustration of mine for many years. And it happens when a requester will submit a Public Information Act request to a governmental entity and say, may I please get, the spending data or some information you have in an Excel file. And that entity responds with a scanned PDF of that Excel file, which then means me as the requester has to go back through and basically pull all of that data from the PDF, enter it into an Excel spreadsheet when they already had it. And so you have a searchable, sortable bill. I was wondering if you could walk us through that particular piece of legislation.
Sure thing. And just to get really quickly on the skeleton day thing, I mean, there is a question, and this is if you're not going to call it a business day, I don't know why you get a business salary, right? But regardless, on the searchable and sortable, I mean, it's kind of complicated, but it's kind of not, because I think you explained it really well. But the way I like to think of it is, let's say someone owes you some money, and they give you the money, but it's inside of a vault with a combination that only they have, right? I mean, they can say they gave it to you, but you still have no real access to it. And so in the case you said, it's a significant amount of work. And that work maybe is okay if it's 1 page, you're just being a jerk, but fine, you're giving it. But what if it's 1,000 pages? Okay, what if it's not a PDF? What if it's something that's even more cryptic? Okay, and I mean, to me, to your point, you start out an Excel document, you literally have to say not save as or send, you literally have to put save as PDF, okay? Or even worse, because we've seen this before, is print, okay, and then go to the scanner, save as PDF, and then good luck trying to get that. And so what we're trying to do with this bill is to say, listen, use reasonable methods and reasonable ways to go and be able to give this information to someone who, again, is your employer, is someone who's making a legitimate legal request, okay? And sometimes it is complicated, right? And there's a bunch of columns, but imagine you go and you ask for your information. So the only thing worse than getting this printed as a PDF is them also taking out the headers and the columns that describe what every single column is, right? Like they get a scissor and they actually take off what the headers are in each one of them. And when we're talking about database and getting that information, that's exactly what's happening. They're giving you the data, but not what that means. And so you don't know the difference between number of deaths, number of pregnancies, number of admittance, percentage pollution, or percentage of people who entered or not. I mean, you have absolutely no way of knowing that. And so what our bill looks to do is to say, come on, right? You have the definitions, you have the headers, you have the explanation, the map, the legend, or whatever. Go and give that. And some entities do it, so they don't all do it. So like I spent a lot of time going and getting, people's voters record and information, right? And so it's an Excel spreadsheet that goes and has just rows and rows and rows of voters registration info and which elections they participated or not. But they do, at least in our county, so this would be one good thing, is they go and they give me another file. And it says, this is what column 1 is, this is what column 2 is, and column 3 is. Our bill wants to make that easier and simpler so that everyone does that, because they need to know it. They know that, I mean, they'll say, oh, well, it's a lot of work to get it. they have to have it in order to do their job and to use it themselves. They have it written down or they have it in a software file too. We just think the public can get that bit of information as well.
Well, as someone who frequently investigates budgets and spending and also submits many PIAs, this is a personal favorite of mine. So you can know that I'll be there to testify in support. Kelley, do you have any thoughts on this particular bill or the business day exception definition that is?
Yeah, I think that he just described it great as far as the searchable bill. I don't think I can really add to that. And then as business days, I just wanted to point out that this is something that is still going on. I mean, at least as recently as the last 3 or 4 weeks, I'm still getting reports from people around the state where say, I can't get any information. My local government is telling me, nah, we're still closed because we're on skeleton crew. We're not going to respond. And interestingly, just in the past month, this happened. And guess what the information was for? It was, can I just please see your policy on skeleton crews and what your business days are? This was a city that said in February, we're not responding to your request. It was really just to kind of ask, are you still on skeleton crew? Are you still not responding to PIA? Because we can't even respond to that because we are on skeleton crew and we're not open for PIA. Then finally this week, apparently they've decided they're open. I guess now the governor has decided that, we can be open 100% for business. I hope a lot of governments around the state hear that message and realize they can start doing PIA requests again, right? But the person that requested this, who was told just last month, no, we're still not responding. Now they're being told, well, we're going to send this to the Attorney General for a ruling because this has to do with attorney-client privilege. Get a load of that. Governments can sometimes make things so hard for themselves. And it's just so much easier on everyone if you just provide the information. If it's something that's requested all the time, put it online. But even so, just, get with it, provide the information, move on. Don't just set up barrier after barrier after barrier, because that not only is bad on the requester, but it's bad on the government employees too. It's a waste of time and money. Provide the information, do what the law says, presume it's open.
And I think one of the more striking things about this last year was many local governments started their fiscal year in October 1. And so while you had a lot of public information departments effectively closed down from one fiscal year to the next, you still saw some instances where their budgets grew, even though they were not responding to any sort of requests.
Yeah. Yeah, you and I have spoken about that before, and it's just amazing. It's like, why is your budget growing if you're not even doing the job that you're supposed to be doing in that department? But go figure.
Donnis, so in addition to the Open Meetings Act, do you guys have any other? Have you seen any other major challenges out there over the last year? And is there any legislation aimed at a particular problem?
Absolutely. I think the poster child issue during the COVID era was whether or not the public had a right to know how many people in a given nursing home had come down with COVID. A lot of us have relatives in nursing homes, and we're very intimately interested in the answer to that question. My mother is in a nursing home. Have there been cases of it in that nursing home? Have there been deaths? How many? And for a long time at the beginning of this, that information was off limits. There was a stone wall put up by state and local government initially, but finally the Attorney General's office realized that this did not violate privacy rules because no one was after the names of the people who had been infected. They only wanted to know if Aunt Martha was in a nursing home that had a major outbreak. There were cases where there were 100 or more infections in a nursing home, and that information was not being released. So you didn't know whether your mother or your aunt or whoever was in a nursing home that had a problem or not initially. So you can imagine the rumor mill that sprang up around things like this. When people started seeing obituaries in the local newspaper and all these old people dying, they began to put two and two together, and they began having to use social media to try to put together their own statistics. That's ridiculous. It's not only ridiculous, it's inaccurate, and it can lead to some very bad information. So what we want is a bill that codifies the fact that this is public information, and it needs to be public information. And so the nursing home transparency bills are HB 3306 by Representative Middleton, SB 882 by Senator Colhorst, and SB 930 by Senator Zaffirini. And it would make it black and white clear that both state and local health authorities have to release statistical information on the frequency of infection in a major disease outbreak. Because people can't make informed judgments about the quality of care in a given facility if they don't have that information. So we're going to be pushing that really hard. And I think that'll, if anything gets through at all this session, I would hope it would be that. I mean, if nothing else does, we shouldn't ever have to wonder whether our mothers and our fathers and our aunts and uncles or whatever are in a nursing home that has a problem or not. Mm-hmm. That's not an unreasonable request. So we're going to be pushing that one really hard.
And so, Donnis, it sounds like the emphasis then is on making sure state and local health authorities respond properly, as opposed to perhaps making private entities subject to the Public Information Act. Is that...
Absolutely. No, we're after the information from the local health authority and the state health authorities, because that should be the most specific and most accurate information, number one. And number two, the public has standing to have them provide that information. You could make an argument that we shouldn't be able to make a private company produce that information. But if that private company is giving that information by law to a state agency or a local health authority, then people ought to have access to the statistical summation of that information, not a particular patient's information. We're not saying that that should be the case, not trying to violate anyone's privacy. We just want people to know the big picture, how many cases there are in a given facility.
Mm-hmm. Representative, I want to go back to you because I know you have a bill that I believe expands upon SB 943 from last session. And for those who may not be familiar with SB 943, that was the bill that you partnered with Senator Watson on to kind of reform the Public Information Act. And I believe that was aimed at government contracts. Yep. But here I see HB, is it 2913 yep. Is perhaps expanding that out a little bit. Can you explain what the problem is there and what it's geared to do?
Yeah, and I will say that besides transparency, one of the things that I've learned to love getting involved in is how government contracts and how government does its procurements, right? I mean, it all starts with, usually, not always, but it usually starts with a process by which people can bid, where the winners are chosen, contracts are drawn out, there's commitments by the entity, there's service or product that's done for that. And quite frankly, I mean, that's where most of the money is spent. Most of the taxpayers' dollars are spent through contracting. I don't have exact latest count, but just the state of Texas has probably almost 40,000 contracts, and they range from very small hourly types of contracts to, I think the biggest one is just over $10 billion, right? So there's real money, and what we want to be able to do, what we did last time is say, listen, people should be able to get and ask for information about some of these contracts. But I think it's time to go to the next level and say, just put them out there. Right? Just make these available on the internet so that everyone can go and see them. And I remember, listen, James, when I first got into this, I just remember doing a bunch of open records requests. And I remember one government, I mean, I did 1,000 in one day. So, but I got this one that called me and they're like, why are you doing this? I'm like, well, I just want to know. I think everyone should know how much you're paying, right? Because for the taxpayer, not only I want to know what the government's doing, but maybe I know someone that can do it better, faster, cheaper. And so next time I can go and get the government better pricing, better service, or whatever. So I was trying to explain that to this fellow. And he's like, yeah, well, we don't want that because we're buying it from Bob and we don't want Steve to know, right? And it's like, okay, but maybe Steve can do a better job. Okay, or maybe there's a Jennifer in another city that can do an even better job, right? And so people will come to us and say, well, that's going to hurt my business. And I don't think it's the government's job to help one company's business, right? It's our job to make this as available as possible. So what we're trying to do with this is to get more contracts, or the availability of contracts, easier for people to see. So we don't even have to go through a lot of this rigmarole that we're having to deal with now. And anyway, I think at the end of the day, it benefits everyone. So maybe not some government entities, but it helps almost everyone else.
And so, Representative, how would you respond to the concern that by putting these contracts online, you're perhaps revealing proprietary information? Does the government want everyone to know what a certain business's secret sauce is?
No, we don't want that. And anyone who's actually read a government contract, it turns out the secret sauce is not an exhibit in the contract, right? It's not like if you say, hey, to Coca-Cola, hey, we're going to buy 20 cases a year from you. They're like, okay, but I'm going to have to put my recipe inside of there. That doesn't happen. It doesn't do it. What we want is the basics, right? Was there a competitive bid or was there not a competitive bid? Okay, who are the people that bid on this project? Okay, I have it here. I mean, you can read it. There's nothing in there that says, and provide your secret hit sauce, right? It doesn't say that. What we're trying to do is make it easier for people to know how much was paid, what the bidding process was. And at the end of the day, it's also to keep people honest, right? I mean, if you knew that you had to put that out there, if every single time I have to put a sole source contract out on the website, I'm not going to do sole source contracting anymore, right? I'm going to work really hard to make sure that as many people do this as possible. And I will say, and when it comes to the pandemic, yes, if there's an actual real short-term emergency, I get it. All hands on deck, get that generator wherever you can have to get that generator. We'll figure it out later. You needed masks today, not tomorrow, go get the masks. 60 days, 90 days later, don't get into 2-year contracts, right? Just don't do it. You do a 30-day contract and then use that time to see if you have to do another 30-day. But there's no reason in this kind of emergency to come up with long-term contracts at prices well above what the market is.
And to your point, Representative, one of the things I've been here long enough to remember when then Texas Controller Susan Combs launched the Where the Money Goes website, right? And as a result of putting state expenditures online, basically they were able to attract the attention of other vendors and drive down spending over time because different folks had lower bids and better offers. And so this actually strikes me in a very similar vein that we have the opportunity to incentivize better, faster, cheaper by putting this information online.
That's right. Oh, and you can find out what they're doing. So there's all sorts of things, but yes, better, faster, cheaper is definitely something that comes out of this.
Let me encourage our audience. We've got several questions rolling in now. I'm going to ask Kelley one final question, and then we'll go to audience Q&A. So if anybody has a question on their mind, feel free to enter it into our live stream chat box, and we'll get it pitched to the panel of experts. Kelley, let me ask you one final thing, because this has been a little bit of a frustration of mine. It seems like over the last year or so, we've seen some governmental entities just flat out not respond to a person's question. You submit a Public Information Act request and the governmental entity just quietly ignores. And I believe there's been a couple of bills filed to correct that problem, HB 3015 and SB 927. Can you walk us through what those bills would do?
Sure. And I'll point out that this is something that's gone on even before the pandemic. Many of these problems that we're talking about here today existed before, but the pandemic just magnified it and made it greater. So for some time, you've had the occasional government that just doesn't respond to a Public Information Act request. And that's not the law. You're supposed to give people the records. So let's say there's records that are available that you're asking for. You're supposed to get them in a timely, in a prompt manner. In the pandemic, we've had many governments that are just not answering because, as we mentioned earlier, about the closed offices and the skeleton crew, although often they'll send kind of an auto reply or at least post it on their website. What we're talking about with these bills is really when, somebody is just, outside of this business day and skeleton crew business in the pandemic, when they're just thumbing their nose at the Public Information Act and just saying, I don't have to respond, or I'm not going to deal with this. Well, that's not right. Part of it talks about, even if there are no responsive records, we have found in the last couple of years, we've come to realize this in talks with the Attorney General's office, that even if there's no responsive records, that governmental entity doesn't by law have to say something to the requester, but really good customer service, which the Attorney General's office encourages, would dictate that they do. Just say, sorry, we've looked, but there really aren't any records responding to what you're asking for. So this would mean that this bill would say, put it into the law to say, if there are no records, that governmental entity needs to tell you so, not just leave you hanging. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Furthermore, they've got to respond. You can't just ignore a Public Information Act request. So there's some provisions in there that are, we call it enforcement, but we're not talking about any fines or, any like just iron fist type things, but to make people more aware of the law and what their responsibilities are in government offices. So if you don't respond to a Public Information Act request, you may have to do some more training to make sure that you are aware of the law, and so that what your responsibilities are, that sort of thing. So it really addresses everyone must get a response when they're making a Public Information Act request, even if the records aren't even there, they don't exist. What you're asking for doesn't exist. You need to know that, so you're not just left hanging. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and actually ignoring a Public Information Act request seems wholly inconsistent with the preamble of the of Chapter 552. I mean, it doesn't jive at all.
No, it doesn't. And it really goes to, as you talked about earlier, James, many government officials realize they're the custodians of the public's records. These records belong to we, the people, and many government officials realize this. Then there are those who forget that or don't realize that. And they need to read that preamble, and they need to get familiar with the law. And maybe they need more training in what the law is and what their responsibilities are. And, if you don't understand that you're there to serve the public, perhaps you're in the wrong job.
Oh, well said. So let me transition now to the audience Q&A portion. We've got several questions coming through now, and I'll just generally throw out the first one here, which has a laundry list of an answer, I believe. But this person asks, what kind of information doesn't fall under a Public Information Act request? So basically, what kind of information is accepted from the law? And I throw that open to our panel.
Let me handle the first part of that question. To go back to what I was talking about a few minutes ago. One thing that's accepted is personal identifiable information about someone's health condition. So we're not after that. We're after statistical aggregate information about how many cases of COVID were in the so-and-so nursing home, how many cases of COVID were in the one down the road, so forth and so on, how many deaths. So the particular individual health information would be accepted from disclosure, and no one's taking issue with that. That's one example.
I can add to that too. Social Security numbers, credit card numbers, if they happen to be in a public record, excuse me, W-2 information, trade secrets, the secret sauce that we talked about earlier. There's a trade secrets provision in the Public Information Act that, it makes all of that off limits to the public. If it's that type of information, you're not going to get it and you shouldn't be getting it. There's also some information that's Homeland Security related. And we had a lot more of this, come into view as being off limits, I should say, be off view after 9/11 and in recent years. So, there's all kinds of considerations, and we don't advocate for every single thing that flows into government to be out there for the public, but most things should be.
Kelley, are you aware of any kind of comprehensive document where it identifies all the various exceptions?
Yes, there is a comprehensive document on the exceptions. You really have to just go through and look at the law. But if you want a real handy list of some of these things that I just mentioned, there is an open records decision that the Attorney General's office did some years ago. And I don't have the number right offhand, but it's prominently displayed on their website that explains, okay, certain things like social security numbers, credit card information, W-2, where your paycheck gets deposited, if that happens to be in a public record, all that stuff is off limits. And that's all spelled out in an open records decision that you can find on the Attorney General's website. But as far as the exceptions, I know you're talking about, the many different subject matters as well.
Because if I recall correctly, the list of exceptions has grown quite substantially over time. And I believe, Kelley, maybe it was FOIP that actually highlighted the fact that local governments in particular were increasingly going to the Attorney General's office under some of these broad exceptions and asking that, the information not be released. Is that right?
Well, yeah, that's right. And you may be talking about, one trend that we're seeing is some governments just throwing the kitchen sink in there when they ask. And for those of you who are watching who don't realize this, we in Texas, we have a very special law compared to other states. The burden is on government if it wants to withhold information. So, it's presumed open and available to us, the public, right? So if a government wants to withhold that information for whatever reason and thinks that it falls under one of these exceptions in the Public Information Act that we were just talking about, then they, in most cases, have to go to the Attorney General's office and get a ruling on that. Sometimes what we see is a government just kind of doing a knee jerk, I don't want to release this information, so I'm going to go to the Attorney General's office and get a ruling, and I'm gonna think a minute about, what exception does it fall under? And they'll send a briefing letter right away to the Attorney General's office that just lists all the exceptions, like over 50 or 60 exceptions, right? And that's just to kind of get it in the door, and then they'll narrow it down and they'll think, oh, okay, here I'm going to pick out these one or two exceptions. Well, if you really think something is not releasable to the public, you should understand right off the bat why and have that in your mind. Why? Otherwise, chances are it's probably going to need to be released. So this whole kitchen sink business, and we do address in one of these bills just about how quickly, if a government's trying to withhold information, that how quickly they need to be coming up with their reasoning for doing so.
Let me move on to the next question. We've got an audience member asking, can we make Public Information Act request documents publicly available online at any given time? And I believe this goes back to something mentioned by you, Kelley, where it is a best practice to put this in frequently asked questions and their responses up online. Is that something that you're noticing, or is anybody noticing governments moving in that direction?
Well, I'll just say something real quick, and our other panelists might want to add, but Public Information Act requests themselves are public information. So, and then as you say, James, if there's something that's coming in frequently, like everyone's asking for a certain, budget document or some kind of financial document at the local school board, rather than having to respond individually, just put it online. You know, if you see the trend, get it out there. Chances are a lot of people want to see it.
So let's transition now to the next question. Have there been cases where information was provided that should not have been provided? What would be the negative issues in that instance? And so I believe this person is getting at, are y'all familiar with information being publicly released where it should not have been released and the consequences thereof? I'm guessing by the silence, nobody is. So it looks like we're, that is a good thing that nobody is knowledgeable on that question. So,
well, the thing is, there are a lot of provisions in the law that make certain things confidential and make it very clear that government officials aren't supposed to release that information. So governments are pretty careful about keeping that secret.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't the rest of you agree?
Yeah.
And I would say this, requesters who do this fairly often, like journalists or advocates, they know what is and is not under the law. You know, what is open under the law for the most part, and that's all they want. They're not trying to get the governmental entity to release some very private and personal information about a child, for example. That's so far off limits that nobody would even ask for that. And so I don't think you get all that many outrageous requests, at least not from those of us that use the access frequently. And if there are outrageous requests that are clearly exceptional information that should not be released, you're not going to get it. If anything, governments are too careful. They look for reasons not to release things too often, rather than that presumption of openness that we think is so important.
I would say, I was thinking about it, one way this does happen is through a method we probably don't think about too much anymore, but or we're going to be thinking about it more, is with, I guess, under the header of data breach, right? Oftentimes we have, whatever, we have governments who have a lot of our personal identifying information, whether that's social security number, insurance information, or whatever. And through usually an accident or through a mistake or even just someone not doing it correctly, they have oftentimes made information, personal identifying information that should not have been released, available. And so I passed some legislation last session so that the AG would be able to record and then how often, and this is not just government, this includes personal, but there was a big case that was in the Dallas Morning News actually about a week ago or 2 weeks ago. But so far, just in the past year, 38 million individuals, and there's only 28 million in Texas, but 38 million individuals, so each person about 1.5 times, has had information about them released or been breached or accessed through other parties. And so what we put into law is that when that information is released by accident or whatever, then the person who's lost that bit of confidentiality has to be notified. And so that way they can do what it takes to be able to protect themselves, whether that's changing their credit card number or whatever. So we do have some mechanisms to try and provide notification like, hey, we screwed up or something happened or we were hacked, and you should probably try and take care of it.
So this next person asks, it appears some governmental entities are teaching county and city clerks on how to delay responding to public information requests. Is there a way to perhaps preempt some of this bad behavior? Is anyone familiar with any instances of?
Yeah, I will. I see this all the time. I get lots of calls in our office of attempts to delay requests. One abuse that goes on is sending a request for a ruling to the Attorney General's office when you know that it's going to be rejected. But that just delays things because the Attorney General's office has up to 45 business days to make a ruling. They often make them sooner than that. But if a government wants to stall, that's one tactic that is used, and that's a waste of taxpayer money right there. Another thing that happens is a requester is often asked to, well, would you clarify your request? I don't really understand what you mean. We, the government, got your request. We don't understand what it means. Can you resubmit it or clarify it? Well, when you do clarify it like that, it restarts the clock and it's treated as a new request. So there you go. There's another 10 days. So this stalling tactic happens a lot. And sometimes there's even a request to clarify the clarification. So one thing I try to tell people is there are some out there, some governments, not all, but some will really count on you just going away. And if you don't follow up and keep being persistent and stand your ground, like very politely and professionally, and say, yeah, well, this is public information and I'd like it. Thank you very much. If you don't follow through and stand your ground and you go away, well, then that stalling and delay tactic has worked. So, just if you're a journalist, if you're a citizen activist, just any curious member of the public, and you thought that information was important enough to ask for, do your part and get the information. And then, it's also frustrating to governments who are actually in good faith providing the information. Say you put in this information request and then you just leave it sitting there, and they've gone to all of this work. Maybe it's a pretty big request and they've done this work and then it's just left on the table. So, be serious about your request, be persistent, and be as narrowly focused as you can too, because that helps everyone.
And to your point about persistence, I don't want to cast government in an entirely bad light, because there are instances where I found, a person in a smaller city or smaller county basically forgot or got distracted or hadn't had an opportunity to respond. And so, after politely reminding, him or her that 10 business days had been met or exceeded, and when could I expect a response to my question? They come back and they apologize and they say, oh, we'll get that to the top of the list and we'll get your information out right away. So there are, we're all human. Accidents do happen. So it's not always some sinister intent, but I agree. There is some attention and some persistence needed there. I think we have time for one last question before we cut off. This person asks, it seems that there is a lack of enforcement. Is there a way to improve compliance? And Kelley, I know you touched on the additional training mechanism contained in HB 3015 and SB 927. Is that kind of the primary avenue, or are there other ways to enforce compliance?
That's a great question, James, because what we're trying to do in those bills that were mentioned earlier is to really, address the overall problem and get training in place when needed. But there's other things that individuals can do on their own. Is if you really have been ignored and your Public Information Act request has been mishandled, you can file a complaint with the Attorney General's office. It's really an informal complaint process, but they can sometimes get involved and help you figure out with that government of, why they've fallen down on the job and not given you the information or not responded to you. If there's an exorbitant cost estimate given associated with your Public Information Act request, they do have a cost complaint path over there too that actually has even more teeth in it, and they can get involved and tell that local government, no, you're charging too much for these records, because there's some set amounts that they can charge for records. Then the other thing is there's always a civil lawsuit that somebody can file, but most of us don't have the time or the money to go that route. And why get things bogged down in court when you can try these other tactics? But for those who have a most severe case and do have the ability, then civil lawsuits are an option as well.
Gentlemen, did either one of you have any closing thoughts on the enforcement component?
Well, I would say that, compliance starts in the heart of the person that's taking the action. And I would hope that our public servants would remember the second word in that term, servants. They're there to help people, the people that pay their salaries, the people who depend on them to do these important jobs that they hold, the people that look to them for guidance at a time when there's a pandemic or there's a huge ice storm or a hurricane or whatever, those are the people that need the help. And if they would just keep a helpful frame of mind and a positive frame of mind about interaction with the public, that would go a long way toward making it work better.
I'll just write in whatever you guys want on enforcement. So whatever it takes, but I think you're both right. I mean, people should just follow the law, especially our elected officials and our government employees. So.
Well, folks, unfortunately, we are running short on time. So I want to thank our panel of experts. What a terrific bunch who are making a huge difference for all of us. And so I wish all of you the best of luck this legislative session. I think everyone is pursuing bills and ideas that are absolutely worthy to the utmost. So good luck. And thank you to our audience. I want to encourage everyone to visit texaspolicy.com for some of our ideas on government transparency and some of the things that we're looking at. And so for everyone, thank you guys very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.